Welcome back. This is Dr. Kelly Smith. We're going to talk next in Module 2 around brain development and how our children's brains have adapted in the environment that they're currently living within. So, when a child is conceived, when a baby is conceived, the brain starts developing pretty soon after that when the parents of the baby provide those basic blueprints for the baby's brain in those genes. So every person is predispositioned to some sort of basic blueprint for brain structure. And everything else around brain development is environmental, in utero and after. So any experiences that the fetus or the child after birth have, any positive or negative experiences shape the process of whether that child will have a strong or weak foundation for all learning, all behavior, and all health. So when you think about motor development, behavioral skills, behavioral control, language, visual, emotional, all those things, neural pathways are being built to develop those throughout a young child's life. When the brain learns something new, it clusters these neurons together to create these neural pathways, and it allows us to go back and forth along this pathway when we're thinking and problem solving. So the more you use those pathways, the stronger they get. So if pathways are being developed around negative experiences, those will be the way that problem solving and thinking moves across those negative pathways and builds up those negative responses. When you think about synapse, those are the synapses that fire and build those pathways from 36 weeks all the way to 6 years. That's the most active brain development in children. So there's this use it or lose it mentality. So as the um, the neural pathways are being built, you can see at 6 months, they're very, very strong. They start solidifying 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, they start solidifying all these synapses around these pathways based on the experiences that this child has had. And if those pathways or those synapses are not connecting or those neurons are not connecting, they lose those neurons. That's what they call synaptic pruning. So I like to think about genes and environment work together to build pathways and prune brains. So you can see in this bottom left-hand picture from age 5 to age 20, the bluer it gets, the more solidified the brain it gets. And that's really around the learning and pathways that that child is experiencing throughout age 20 is what's creating their thinking brains and their emotional brains and their motor brains, all the things that makes that person function. So when you think about early brain growth, it's a fascinating and crucial stage. During this time, the brain experiences this rapid development of neural connections. These connections are essential for several key functions. First, behavioral control. During this period, children start to learn how to manage their actions and their reactions based on experiences. The next is language acquisition. This is when children are like sponges. They absorb language and they start to communicate, which is fundamental for future learning and interactions. Emotional regulation. That's where children really understand how their own emotions and those of others affect the environment, and it really lays the foundation for their future social skills and abilities to interact socially in socially appropriate ways. So this rapid brain development in the early stages really builds those pathways for their motor control, their memory, their logic, their learning, and then all future social interactions, which is why it's so critical when you think about experiences in that early development of children, why that's so important for later learning and wellness. The brain, when a student enters school, 90% of their brain has been developed, and those foundational pieces have been put in place in the best environment. So, if all things are created equal and positive experiences were being had, those pathways would be built for students to engage at high levels of learning right when they get into kindergarten. And we know that brains are developed from the bottom up, the brainstem first, from those primitive sensory motor survival seeking brain all the way to the top of the brain, which is that cortical brain, which is the executive functioning part of the brain, which is where all learning and what we rely on for executive functioning in schools. I like this slide when I talk with parents about the typical brain development. We know that by age 16, only half of that prefrontal cortex is fully developed. That's the thinking part of the brain. So when I talk to parents about um, the impulsivity part of the brain and the thinking part of the brain, and when a student is 16, their impulsivity part of the brain is the most developed. So they have what I like to say, an overactive accelerator. So they're doing things that feel good because that's fully developed. And their logical brain, the break part that says, whoa, that's probably not a great idea, is only 50% developed. So when kids make big mistakes when they're in their teenage years, and parents say, and I've said this to my own kids, what were you thinking? They probably weren't. They were fully relying on what feels good and what's impulsive in the moment, and not about what's logically not safe to do. So it's an important slide. I love to use this with parents. So let's talk a little bit about pathway development. So we talk about neural pathways. How were neural pathways developed 30 years ago, and how are neural pathways with childhood environments being developed now? So in this graphic then, when I was a child in the 70s, we had different kinds of play, and these are not meant to be criticisms. There are lots of great advancements that's been made in our world. I just want you to think about how those advancements are changing the way our students' pathways are being developed and why our educational systems need to change with them. So when you think this is a kind of a satire, so when you think of this picture, when kids are interacting in play, there's not in the top picture any technology happening here. This is really around problem solving. So those pathways, can you hear me? Probably not. They're problem solving, running across the street. Physical activity pathways, running back across the street, more physical activity, doing some of those pathway development. The bottom picture, a student is on his computer, picks up the phone. Why are you calling me? You could have mentioned me instead. So not a lot of social interaction pathways are being developed in that picture. I like this one because I grew up in Michigan and I was back home visiting my family recently, and they still have these bank machines where you put your check in and it shoots through the vacuum to the bank teller. That was pretty impressive to me as a kid. It still kind of is cool when you go back and think about how archaic that is. When our kids are in school now, there's different things that get them engaged. This is virtual reality. Kids can step into um, things that they would never even have thought about when I was a kid. So think about the pathways that are being developed when they're interacting with these different kinds of technologies. This slide is always pretty powerful to me when you think about childhood then and childhood now. Everything in that picture on the left is in the phone on the right. So all the things that as teenagers, past generations interacted with and figured out and um, worked with is all in kids' pockets now. And think about the pathways that are being developed when they interact in those different generational um, things. So there's been a lot of discussion around the new book that Jonathan Haidt wrote with the anxious generation, and I really looked at it in the way around pathway development. Now he talks about social interaction and how that has changed, and I think about that, about how brains are being developed differently. So he talks about the synchronous face-to-face interactions that kids had in past generations. They developed these positive connections. They developed this attunement. They could read facial cues. If a student was outside playing marbles and they got into a conflict, they would look and see those um, innuendos, the body language, the facial expressions, and they would build these pathways so that they were better able to read those cues when they got into school. When you think about the challenges of building paper boats, if someone leaned over and smashed someone's boat and it sank, how would they be building solving those conflicts and building those pathways. So think about all the ways that kids played decades ago. And then I want you to look at this next slide. How are we building these social pathways and these interactions now? So the picture on the upper left, when kids are around the iPad, yes, they're together. I would argue that there's not a lot of social collaboration pathway being built. They're all focused in on this iPad. The bottom left, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit around VR and child brains, but think about pathways. So the student might be looking at a person in a VR, but are they able to fire the synapses in the same brain as if another child was sitting next to them and making facial expressions that they could respond to and get immediate feedback to right away? Same with the bottom right, no interactions. Upper right, yes, the parent is, so that's better than the bottom right, but in the upper right, the parent is still there, but there's not that facial um, response. They're really focused in on this two-dimensional recording device. And then the middle top one, yes, physical activity is good, sports, competitive sports, great. But think about if there was a conflict on that team, who would be solving that conflict? Would it be solved amongst the players, or would the coach be facilitating that? So just think about not good or bad, but what are some of those pathways that are being developed through that? So, one of the things that he also talks about, Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Anxious Generation, is how are we building agency, resilience, and navigation of conflict in our students' brains in that pathway. Um, he argues that we need to provide students more unsupervised outdoor play so that they know how to handle risks. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some type of parental guidance around that, but decades ago, kids would stay outside and play all day without really any adult interaction. And did they get hurt? Yes. Did they get hurt to the degree that it was unfixable? I would argue probably not. So this is something to think about of how are students being allowed to navigate this type of play to build those pathways. So consider then and now. So then, and these are pictures that I got off Google Images, and I think they're a little dramatic, but our playgrounds are quite different now than they were then. I like the one of the teeter-totter. We didn't use it as kids as teeter-totters. We used them as who could fling the other person off the end. Yes, kids probably got hurt, but think about the pathways of critical thinking, navigating risk, um, looking at the other person and seeing from their facial cues and body language, how upset are they with me? Can I negotiate my way out of this? Is this fun? Is this not fun? So just consider how did this type of playground equipment and play develop pathways so that students were able to navigate the social situations we're asking them to navigate now? And then these are some pictures of things of how kids play together now. Playgrounds on the bottom right, how they look like now, pretty safe, not a lot of ways for kids to interact um, and calculate risk like in past playgrounds. Bottom left with the climbing wall, yes, this is great. Is there a lot of conversation or adult interference when students are trying to problem solve how to climb that wall? So to think about that, unsupervised access to the world in digital media now, there's not a lot of parental controls that the wide majority of parents, our kids are pretty smart, they know how to get around those. And then we really give a lot of restrictive access to the physical world. And the physical world, when kids are navigating that, is what's really building those social pathways for students to be able to engage in high levels of social interaction, emotional development, and academic achievement in schools. So Jonathan then goes in and talk about, do we build our kids up to be in this discover mode and this curiosity mode? Are we asking kids and when they get into school to scan for opportunities and seeking new experiences, being critical and thinking of things, critical thinking and being curious and asking questions by the way that their brains have been developed earlier? Or are we setting them up to really scan every environment for danger, being defensive, being anxious because we're not sure how things are going to turn out, setting them up, everything could be a risk. Think about when kids are going out into the world, if we're giving them this litany of things that could go wrong and that they have to watch out for, or are we letting them kind of fall down and navigate that a little bit on their own? Um, I think this is really important to think about in schools when we hear from parents about how bullying is on the rise. Are we setting kids up to scan for kids that may be bullies, scan for interactions that may um, be directed towards me? How are we setting up these mindsets for kids to be successful in navigating those social cues in school? So let's jump into talking about stress and the developing brain. So we know that when kids are in situations that increase their heart rate, makes them anxious, there are positive stress responses. We want kids to be able to navigate when things get a little heightened. How can they navigate their way to regulate themselves so that they can get back to this tolerable and Zen type place in their learning. So there's positive stress, which is those um, short-term stressful things that they navigate themselves out of. There's tolerable stress, which is temporary stress, which is buffered by adult help when they get into stressful situations, and we teach them how to cope, and then they can get back to normal behavioral regulation. And then there's toxic stress. This is when kids are put in situations where they're in environments that are chronically stressful, and their body's having to respond to that. And in education, we've talked a lot about the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. Some folks don't really understand the fawn response. That was sort of new to me. But when you think about the fight, fight, flee, freeze, this is when the emotional, the fight or flight part of the brain, that bottom part of the brain really takes over and shuts down the learning part of the brain. So we like to think about the wizard or lizard brain. Are you thinking, or are you going into survival mode? So if kids are stressed, their response could be any one of these things. It could be to fight their way out of it. It could be to run away from it. So when you think of running away from a bear, you're trying to get yourself away from the situation so that you're safe. Do you freeze? Do you hide? Do you hope that the threat just goes away? Or we see this a lot. I saw this a lot as a principal with my staff during COVID. They were in a fawn response where their thinking brain was shut down. They were just trying to make everybody happy. They were just moving along. They did whatever they could just to avoid any kind of conflict. And I would argue that a lot of our kids live within this fawn response, and we think that they're being compliant in their learning, but their frontal lobe is really shut down and they're not taking in any learning. They're just in this response where they're trying to get through the day. So when you think about that, as we're going through some of these environmental factors that are really closing down the executive functioning part of the brain for kids. I talked a little bit earlier about toxic stress, this prolonged activation of this stress response. So when chronic stress is happening, this is unbuffered stress that overwhelms the body, the physical body. This is when we're avoiding any type of stress um, that we have, and this is when it's particularly damaging to developing brains because it shuts down all the processes that young people need to grow their bodies. It can have catastrophic damage to the pathways in the brain, hormone production, the immune system. Lots of times, kids that are under chronic stress are sick a lot of the times because all of their body resources are being directed towards keeping that student alive. Um, and anything else that's a byproduct of that is being shut down. So I like this picture because it really talks about, and you get a visual of when a child is stressed, their brain closes down to anything but the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. and all learning or behavior that helps grow is closed. So the unstressed brain, the prefrontal cortex is open, and students are able to learn at high levels and respond in appropriate ways. When the brain is stressed, that brain is shut off. So if you're asking kids to um, engage in academic learning when they're in a fight, flight, freeze, or spawn response, nothing is coming through. This presents in schools like hyperactivity, lack of attention, impulsivity, learning difficulties. So, if students in your class are exhibiting these things, the first thing that I would ask is what is their environment like outside of school? Are they living within a chronic toxic stress environment where they're not able to learn? The first thing that's really important, and I don't think we do a good job talking to educators about what ACEs is, adverse childhood experiences, and I'm going to dive into that in just a minute. Um, but when you think about developmental trauma and ACEs, these are two big indicators that damage the developing brains of our youth. So ACEs are really any events that occur in childhood that may increase the risk of adverse outcomes later in life. Things like abuse, neglect, household challenges, and we're going to talk about some of those other areas. Those are types of ACEs. And we know right now that 61% of our youth report at least one ACE. And when kids are in these adverse experiences, they are living within chronic stress, which is stopping any type of or um, e- physical or academic development in their brains. Developmental trauma is really around these chronic adverse experiences in childhood. Unlike acute trauma, developmental trauma is these single events that happen, but when they happen over and over and over, it really dysregulates this stress response. It gives them a heightened stress reactivity, and it impairs their ability to be able to do anything else. Behaviorally, individuals that exhibit this hypervigilance or emotional dysregulation, um, the long-term effects of that are physical illness, mental health disorders, all things that are negative to the development of their brain and body. And if you haven't heard of Dr. Nadine Burke, there is a great video on YouTube that she talks about. It's about 15 minutes, and I highly recommend every educator watch this. She talks about in her practice in an impoverished part of San Francisco, she was getting a lot of referrals for students from primary health or from schools to her because students were exhibiting ADHD. And she knew as a medical doctor that this would be very unusual to have this many students diagnosed with ADHD. So she did a little digging. And what she found was actually these students were living in environments around chronic toxic stress, and they were exhibiting symptoms of ADHD when it really wasn't ADHD. It was ACEs, chronic adverse experiences. And then she talks in her book, and there's a link to that in here too, around what she did around wellness interventions that reverse the effects of the damage that this chronic stress did. So I highly recommend it. There's a link to this article right here around the relationship of child abuse um, and ADHD and trauma. This is a picture that talks about neglect. A normal brain of a 3-year-old and extreme neglect, it just shrinks the brain. It damages the brain so severely that that student, um, when they're in chronic stress, the frontal lobe can't grow. So it delays the growth of the learning part of their brain, and it changes that brain. So Dr. Nadine Burke, here is a list of the 10 ACEs. So if you're not familiar with the ACE study, I would read it. There's a link in this deck to that. It happened back in the early 90s, 1700 health insured white middle class folks took that study, and it was staggering to find out how many of those adults had at least one ACE when they were in their childhood and the impact on their health outcomes later in life was staggering. So think about our marginalized youth right now that are living with more than one ACE and the detrimental impact on their brains and their health now. So it's really important that you understand that as an educator. So I highly recommend reading her book, The Deepest Well. It dives into that a lot. She actually adds these supplemental questions anytime a student comes into her practice. She asks the parents anonymously how many of them have these ACEs and then supplemental ACEs, because we know research has proven that if a student has one or more ACEs, there are behavioral and health outcomes that are impacted. And so think about the supplemental ones: foster care, harassment or bullying at school, um, living with a child who or a parent who has died. Think about COVID, how many kids lost family members because of COVID and the damage that did to their brains. So here's just some things. I'm not going to dive into it a lot, but I would recommend this is something that you really look at. If you have a lot of kids that are exhibiting behavioral issues at school, are you asking these questions? Can your team really dive into, are there ACEs in this child's background, and how can we put in some wellness interventions rather than um, academic interventions, because those won't work if their brains are not healthy. So this is something. Zaretta Hammond is a very renowned researcher um, on how learning for um, our English as a second language students are approaching school. And she put together when students are moving away from pain and they're focused mostly, this is that fight or flight response, they're mostly focused on how can I get away from whatever this fight, fight, or freeze stress response is? What is my physical reaction to that? What's the social implication to that? And how do I move towards protecting myself? And she talks a lot in her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, about what that looks like in school. So here's a chart that I just thought was pretty interesting around the physical reaction and social implications of how students are presenting. So here's the impact of ACEs on development. If students have adverse childhood experiences, it disrupts the neural pathways. It causes a delay in the social, emotional, cognitive impairment. Remember, their frontal lobe can't grow, and then they're not interacting appropriately socially. And then they start adopting risky behaviors so that they can then start connecting. It's a natural response. If they don't feel connected and they're in this fight or flight response, they're going to develop behaviors that are going to help them feel better. They're going back to that that feel good part of their brain. And then later in life, they are more susceptible to disease, disability, and social problems. And here's the pyramid of adverse experiences on health outcomes. Generational, and I didn't get into this, but historical trauma. There is biological evidence that if a parent had trauma, the genes were changed developmentally and passed down. So kids of trauma parents are more susceptible to intergenerational trauma. So they're starting at a deficit. And that's why it's even more important that those neural pathways are developed in those positive behaviors. So if there's historical or generational trauma, there's social conditions, they have a propensity towards more stress, adverse experiences, more stress, disrupted neural development, social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of risky behaviors, disease, social problem. And then there is evidence that shows kids that have these severe chronic toxic stress will have an early death. Students with ACEs are more likely to engage in risky behavior because they want to feel better. They're seeking connection and they're seeking ways to make themselves feel better. So they're in a constant state of higher alert. They're more impulsive, they're less regulated, and they're extremely sensitive to potential triggers. So what does this mean in school? What's a common consequence if kids are disrupted? In schools, we exclude them. We take that connection away. We take away the way to help them regulate and get them back into this regulation where it can open up their frontal lobe and help them learn. So consider a student with high ACEs that's being suspended for behavior, given that they're a higher risk for risky behavior outside of school. So if they're dysregulated at school, they're suspended, they're going outside, they're becoming more dysregulated, they're adopting more risky behaviors. Toxic stress and behavior in the classroom. We already talked a little bit about this inability to focus. This study really talks about zero ACEs. Only 30% of our kids um, exhibit with behaviors, negative behaviors in school. Kids with 3 or more ACEs are 80 times more likely to have behavior problems in schools. 80% of our kids with behavior problems have 3 or more ACEs. So that's why it's so critical when kids are having behavior problems to ask about what their home lives are like. Are they in a chronic state of toxic stress that's hijacking their frontal lobe and not allowing them to learn? This chart is pretty staggering around a high school classroom. When you think about the students in purple, dark purple to light purple, dark purple is 3 or more, 6 or more ACEs, 4 or 5 more ACEs with the lighter purple, the greens, 2 ACEs, and then the very light, no ACEs. So think about a typical classroom. If you have kids that are 6 or more ACEs, they are not learning. It doesn't matter what's happening, and you could have the best engaging lesson, their frontal lobe is not available for learning. So it's really critical that we start thinking about how our schools are putting strategies in place so that we can regulate those and neutralize that stress response so that frontal lobe can open. Toxic stress and behavior. Students with 4 or more ACEs are 12 times more likely to commit suicide and 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic because they're seeking behaviors to make them feel better and to regulate that cortisol, that stress in their brain. So among elementary students that have 3 or more ACEs, they're 3 times more likely for academic failure, 4 times more likely to have poor health outcomes, 5 times more likely to have severe attendance problems, and 6 times more likely to have severe behavioral outcomes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on COVID and the brain, but think about our students' brains. There's a study linked here about how the neural pathways changed during COVID. Um, Similar to chronic adversity, kids after COVID, they had larger parts of their brain, like that amygdala, that fight or flight response was bigger. So think about the pathways that were developed during COVID. Our kids saw pictures on the news about how everyone was going to die. They went to school with masks on, pathways around there's a threat in my classroom. The cortisol is firing in their brain, shutting down the learning brain. So that changed the way kids' pathways were being developed during COVID. And it's even more important that we start to um, rebuild some of those positive pathways so that they're not living within this chronic toxic stress. Here's a chart, and there's a link in the deck too, around babies in 2019 to babies in 2023 being evaluated for um, different developmental outcomes. So in 2019, that's the green bar around adaptive behaviors, much smaller than babies in 2023 that were being evaluated for delays in adaptive behavior. Cognitive delays, 2019 to 2023, much higher. Communication delays, 2019 to 2023, physical delays, and social emotional delays, babies from 2019 to 2023. So it's important to think about pre and post pandemic. It's around that pathway development. Kids were not experienced these positive experiences to develop pathways to be able to be adaptive. Their brains were in toxic stress, so their frontal lobes were closed. So it's really, really critical to think about how are we rebuilding brains after COVID. So let's jump into how screens are changing kids' brains. There's research now that's showing that there's this smaller cortical thickness that's linked to cognitive impairment, which is the area of the brain that supports cognitive function, visual memory, the ability to organize and manipulate spatial information. That part of the brain is smaller in kids that were on their screens more than 1 hour a day. And I think about when I go into the world and I see kids, babies, with their mom's cell phones, babies that are developing smaller brains in the area that helps them engage in critical thinking and problem solving. We need to let young parents know the detrimental impact of just holding a cell phone for a long period of time and looking at that screen rather than interacting in the world. Um, I was in a national park not long ago on a hiking trail with my kids, and I saw a person with a backpack and a baby in the backpack with a pouch for an iPad. The baby was in the backpack in this beautiful environment with a parent looking at an iPad. And I thought, oh my goodness, I wanted to have a conversation with that young family about how those pathways were being developed in that moment and how they were really missing an opportunity to be able to develop these um, neural pathways to really grow the cortical thickness in their brain, but they would have looked at me as if I was crazy. So maybe I did the wrong thing by not interacting, but I think it's critical now more than ever that we're having conversations with families around the brains that they're developing in their babies. Again, brains of 3 to 5 year olds, lower level development in white matter. And this is a key area of language literacy and cognitive skills. We're seeing an uptick in language delays in our preschoolers. And I believe it's a direct link to pathway development because kids are on screens more. This is an interesting study that was done around glucose metabolism variations. So we know that brains use sugar to metabolize and develop. The sugar is what is the fuel to develop pathways and move neurotransmitters around, which solidify pathways. And screens are disrupting the processing of that sugar. So this is an interesting article about when cell phones are on or off, how that sugar is being um, that sugar is being metabolized at faster and slower rates, disrupting neural pathway development. Screens on developing brains. So 50% of 4 year olds or younger are engaging in smartphones regularly, and 8 to 12 year olds spend 4 to 6 hours on screens. Right now, the American Academy of Adolescent Psychiatry is saying no screens until kids are almost two. No screens because it's so detrimental to the pathway development of kids. This was frustrating to me when I saw this. This was an ad for virtual reality, and this was an adult brain, and they were advertising that virtual reality, look at how engaging it is to the brain, the adult brain, and they were using it as a positive ad campaign for VR. There is no research that I could find on children and VR. So my argument is if the brain is being lit up this significantly in adult brains, how is it being lit up for baby brains and kid brains? That to me is alarming. I would never put a VR on a kid. Not right now, not until we know the effects that it has on pathway development and how it's changing the growth of our youth brains. I just think this is irresponsible marketing, um, especially to our youth. And we really need to be careful about how this is being marketed to young parents for kids. So, if you've not read anything from the Social Institute, this is an organization that does a lot of surveying of youth around social media. This was a graph that came out in 2024 around how they asked youth, how old were you when you got your first smartphone? Um, from 4 years old all the way up to 15. So the sweet spot seems to be age 11 at 20%. 11 is like fifth grade, fifth and sixth grade. Right now, there's a recommendation nationally and worldwide. Kids should not be getting cell phones until they're going into high school, the end of their eighth grade year, which is about 14 or 15 years old. So kids are getting smartphones much earlier than is recommended. And then the next graph is how old were you when you got your first social media account? The sweet spot here is 12. Now, given what we know and what I've just talked about with brain development and pathway development, I'm alarmed. At 12 years old, if kids are having unrestricted access to what's being put on social media, think about the addictive behaviors that are starting to happen at age 12 and the pathways that are being developed. So this to me, pretty concerning. More concerning too is that we have 11% of our 10-year-olds, 7% of our 9-year-olds. What are kids doing and seeing that their brains cannot compute at that age? So think about social rewards in brains. There's lots of research around drug use and youth in brains and how it changes the pathways and the addictive factors in brains. Um, that is happening the same with social media. So there's something in the brain around social rewards. So between the ages of 10 and 12, changes in the brain make this social reward environmental rewards feel much more satisfying. So when kids in teenage kids and young kids are being complimented by a new hairstyle, the firings and brains of youth, it's much more satisfying for kids at that age because of that social reward development. So when kids are getting affirmations from TikTok, it's much more satisfying. So they get addicted to this social reward. So back decades ago, when youth were given compliments for hairstyle or laughing because of a joke, it was periodically throughout their day. But think about now, if students are constantly on TikTok and they're posting things and getting this barrage of positive affirmation, think about how that's changing the social reward part of their brain. There is research that talks about dopamine, which is that feel good hormone, that when adults and youth do cocaine, it raises the threshold for that dopamine fix that they need. Same thing is happening with social media, um, the social media dopamine hit after hit raises that threshold. So kids need more and more hits on social media to have that feeling good, that dopamine response. Um, so that's pretty scary and startling when you think about our youth on changing how dopamine and oxytocin is being delivered to their brain. This is also from the Social Institute around parts of the brain that are driven by instinctual behavior. It's really important to understand that social media was developed for the adult brain. Adult brains are already developed. They already have pathways to um, as a foundation to understand that social reward pathway. Kids do not. Their brain is still being developed. So when they're on social media and interacting with these social pathways, it's changing the way their brain is being developed. And this chart talks about which apps are ninth graders using the most. When you look at Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, 3/4 of our kids are on those social media platforms, YouTube, getting this fix of dopamine over and over and over, developing those pathways. Um, when you think about third through fifth graders on Roblox, those interactive connections, what are they being exposed to? What pathways are being developed? This is a great video that's the social dilemma, the mental health dilemma. This was a documentary, I think it was on Netflix, around social media and the developing brain. This is a great video to put out and show parents around the detrimental impacts on mental health and physical health from social media. They're finding now that students that are addicted to social media are have even more sensitivity to social cues. They have poorer memory, increased impulsivity, and like I talked about, those dopamine hits from likes and shares um, can really lead to more addictive behaviors. And there's some links here that corroborate that study. Again, so social media in the developing brain, bottom line is excessive use and the ability to see more mature content. They're at risk for more bullying, and it's changing developing brains. It's making the amygdala, that fight or flight part of the brain, bigger, and it's stopping the growth of the prefrontal cortex, which is the learning part of the brain. So kids that are addicted to social media have larger parts of the brain that control that respond to emotional impulses and that fight or flight response, and less ability to put the brake on. So more accelerator, less brake if they're addicted to social media. So let's talk a little bit about caffeine. Um, Caffeine is one of the most widely used and abused psychoactive stimulants in the world. It's the only addictive stimulant that we readily give our children and teens. Let that sink in. We would never give stimulants without doctor guidance, but we do with caffeine. The damaging part of caffeine um, is around sleep as well. It has a half-life of 5 to 7 hours. So if kids are drinking those energy drinks at dinner, their brains are not shutting down really at all at night. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that type of sleep that our teens need to grow the learning pathways in their brains. But the biggest piece around caffeine is that blocks this sleep hormone called adenosine. And when it blocks adenosine, kids can't fall asleep and get the right stages of sleep that they developmentally need. There's a study that Matthew Walker did in his book, Why We Sleep. It's an excellent book, I highly recommend, around the effects of various drugs in an experiment that they did with spiders, which I thought was quite interesting. So, the normal spiders without any drugs in their system were able to develop the normal web on the left. When you look at the bottom right, spiders that were given caffeine, their web development was similar to um, other drugs in their systems like LSD, speed, and marijuana. Pretty alarming. I don't think parents really understand the impact caffeine has on developing brains. So let's talk about sleep. Matthew Walker also talks, and there's a link here too, around the developmental effects or damages that it has to children. So children who had insufficient sleep had smaller volumes in their brains, specifically in the areas responsible for attention, memory, and impulse control. If kids had less than 9 hours of sleep chronically, it led to cognitive difficulties, mental problem, and their brains were actually not as large. Um, it's really important to talk to parents about how sleep is the most critical thing that developing brains need to process emotions and solidify learning. So, again, if students are having behavioral problems in school, the first question we need to ask is what is their toxic stress level outside of school? Are they in a state of chronic stress? And what is their sleep? Because that changes the pathways in brain development that presents very similarly to ADHD, behavioral outbursts, all of that. So, just very briefly, what happens when we sleep? Early in the night is their non-REM sleep. This is when the learning that kids have during the day solidifies and moves to long-term memory. It processes their reasoning, their critical thinking. It's imperative that they have this phase of sleep at night. So, think about if students are kids are drinking caffeine, they miss this early non-REM sleep. So all the learning they did during the day did not get moved to long-term memory. It's like the next day they didn't even learn it. So if you have kids in your classrooms that you just taught this the day before, they can't remember it. The first question I would ask is, how many hours of sleep did you get last night? Next, I want you to, the next phase of sleep is this rapid eye movement sleep. The second half of the night, that's responsible for emotional processing and social cognition. So, early start times in school, I know it's a big debate, but when you think about teenagers' biological clocks, they are pushed back. So, their circadian rhythm, if they're waking up before they had the REM sleep phase, they did not have a chance to process their emotional behavioral regulation from the day before. So they're coming to school still dysregulated from whatever happened the day before. Um, there is scientific research that is used on post-traumatic stress veterans that have been in severe post-traumatic situations where they use EMDR, which is a form of rapid eye movement that they are doing with um, to process stress and emotion. They're taking that research from this sleep phase. So there's lots of research that supports this REM sleep is critical to behavioral regulation and emotional processing. And if our kids aren't getting it, they're coming to school more dysregulated than they were the day before. So if you have students that are coming to school and they are going from very sleepy to highly excited to very angry to screaming to shutting down, the number one question I would ask is, what is your sleep pattern? What's your sleep log? Talk to your school nurse, get them on a sleep um, intervention, have them learn about why sleep is so important, get a sleep log, start developing some of those habits. I firmly believe that if we could fix the sleep deprivation in our country, behavior would overall improve in our schools. It's the single best intervention we can do to support kids' regulation in school. And lastly, alcohol in the developing brain. When kids are drinking alcohol, reduces the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory and learning. That's where um, that learning is stored. 10, there's a 10% reduction in the size of the hippocampus for kids who drink alcohol when their brains are still developing. The prefrontal cortex is important for planning, judgment, and decision making. And kids who drink alcohol, they have smaller prefrontal cortexes. So I know there's a mantra out there that if um, kids are drinking alcohol and they're not going anywhere, they're safe. So if they're not driving, it's okay if it's in my home if they're not going anywhere and I can watch them. That is absolutely not true. It's damaging teenage brains. If we can prolong it, the longer the better. So we can get their brains growing. The longer you can procrastinate from having youth drink alcohol, the better. We know that alcohol is on the rise in youth in Colorado. I am from Colorado. Some of these slides are really data from Colorado, but the Healthy Kids Colorado survey is derived from the CDE survey that I talked about earlier. And there is this binge drinking that is on the rise in middle school youth. So the effect, all of the things that I talked about, ACEs, lack of sleep, excessive screen time, drugs and caffeine, types of play, alcohol, body image, and access to pretty much anything on the internet is changing our kids' brains. They're structurally different than they were decades ago. Um, and it's critical that we understand why. So, trying to sum this up, our kids' brains are structured differently. So, because of the things that I talked about, their brains, their gray matter in their brains is physically changing. Their emotional memory and motivation, the limbic part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, executive functionings, behavior, and personality are all changing because of those environmental influence. This is why our kids are showing up to school behaving differently, interacting and learning and social situations differently. Their brains are being wired to behave in a certain way, and they're showing up for school, and our schools look very similarly as they've been for the past decades, and we're wondering why kids are not able to engage in learning in the same ways that they have been. Um, and I just talked about why. So when you think about the foundational skills that kids need for school, Pamela Cantor and the Turnaround Institute researched what are the skills needed for learning in school that can be taught and can be measured. And they built this building block of learning. And they identified these bottom three rows that are critical to be developed before kids enter school. Now, I'm not saying that they engage in these skills like you would as a 20-year-old, but these bottom three rows need to be foundationally built before kids enter school so that they can engage in learning, which are those top two rows. So the bottom row is attachment, stress management, self-regulation. So think about if pathways were not being developed for self-regulation, when kids enter kindergarten, they're unable to read social cues of other kids and can't self-regulate themselves. They can't read social cues of others. They have difficulty connecting to other kids. The second row, self-awareness, social awareness, relationship, um, all of those things that they need to interact appropriately and socially in the way schools have always run. If they have pathways that have not developed those, they have holes. And then they cannot engage in those top two rows, those six skills that are necessary for learning. So this is a really interesting graphic that um, I really like to talk with staff about because 30 years ago, when I was in teacher training school, we were taught that if you teach to the middle, 90% of kids are going to get that. You have 10% that there's exceptions. They've had ACEs, they've had difficult experiences, they have developmental delays, and you can provide other services outside your room for them. But 90% of kids have healthy brains. They have the same positive experiences that they all grew up the same. So you're teaching to 90% the same. That now is different because kids' experiences are so varied based on so much access and environmental influence that the triangle is now upside down. 90% of our kids are coming to school with differently developed brains. Going back to that building block, 90% of our kids have different areas of strengths in those bottom three rows based on their pathways. And there's only 10% of kids that are actually developed the same. So think about when you're putting kids in a classroom, 90% of them have holes in these foundational skills and are not able to access learning in the way that our classrooms are designed. That is an impossible situation for our teachers to be in. There is no way that our staff can differentiate to 90% of our kids' brains in the way that we're asking them to do, which is why I'm making a case for what needs to happen structurally in our schools. So I want you to think about that. So the top two rows, like I referred to, self-direction, curiosity, civic integrity, academic tenacity, which is powering through when things are hard academically. Do I have the skills to be able to continue to try? Agency, can I figure this out? Do I have skills to help figure this out? And resilience. Even in kindergarten, we ask kids to engage in those skills. And according to the research, they can't engage in those skills if they have holes in the bottom three rows and those bottom skills. You can't do it. Kids are not able to succeed um, effectively. So all the things that I talked about When there are lack of development in those skills, we're sending kids to school with this defend mode thinking, lower skill development in solving conflicts, defensiveness, assuming negative intent, reduced empathy, limited opportunities for face-to-face interactions inhibits the development of this critical skill to understand others' perspectives. When kids have impaired social skills, when they have constant exposure to social media, it can lead to unrealistic expectation on what needs to happen socially in schools. It can negatively impact social skills and inhibit skill development in social interactions. Disrupted sleep. If kids aren't able to get sleep, their frontal lobes are not growing and they don't have the ability to process and behaviorally regulate themselves so they're ready to show up for school the next day and their learning is not solidified. So when they have these skill deficits in self-regulation and self-awareness, which are critical in navigating social conflicts, it can lead to these bullying type behaviors that we're hearing more and more of in school. So summarizing this, we're at a fork in the road. And so I would ask you, there are two ways to go, given what I just talked about, and now what we know about the neuroscience of youth development and the environmental factors that are happening in our youth's brains. Are we going to stay the course and do what we've always done and lament every day about how kids are different, behaviors are bad, academics are lower, we can't get them to engage, teachers are burnt out? Are we going to stay the course and design our system in our schools and our supports in our schools the same? Or are we going to follow the science and know that kids need something different? I ask you that question. I'm going to pause at the end of this module. Module 3, we're going to jump in and talk about how we can change schools to meet the developmental need of our kids. So I ask you, stay the course or follow the science? Where are you landing right now?